Hello everyone. So as part of this Python object-oriented programming series, this is the third video we're going to discuss about the most common method which we have to use in all our class class object-oriented stuff, especially in Python. So people used to say when we create a program, right? So we want to show or we want to provide us some information about that program, right? Like a document string, of course, is that. But eventually, as another developer or the end user wants to access our class using the other objects, right? Then this the topic which we're going to cover today which will really help to understand what is the all about the class itself, and also we can do some debugging on top of the existing code itself using the object instantiation. Okay, so without delay, let's jump on to discuss about dunder str, or called otherwise called double underscore str, or otherwise called magic method. So people call this method about magic or dunder. So I personally don't like to have this name magic because it doesn't have any related magic stuff. But I used to prefer, say, dunder method, dunder str, or dunder rep. It's up to you guys. Based on your convenient, you can define. You can have your own name for a given method. Okay, and end of this video, we'll see real-time example of how this really help us to implement in real-time situation. I'm gonna use Django here. We'll see how this dendristr and the wrapper it'll be gonna helpful in order to in a real-time situation itself. Okay, let's jump on. So since this is a object-oriented video, right, series, so obviously what we have the first keyword, we have to type the class and think about this is employee class, and I'm having default dunder init method. This is called initialize the class variable using the instance variable. When you instantiate the class using the object, then the dunder init method will call automatically, and it will assign the value to the given instance variable itself. So if you're not familiar with this, I request to uh, take a look on the first part of the video of the series. You might get an idea what is actually it's all about dunder init method. Okay, self. Let's assume I want have um, a first name, which is employee first name, and last name. So since this is a instance variable, so we have to use a self keyword, to access assign the variable, right? First name and equal to which is first name, and self last name equal to last name. Super, right? Now let me scroll a little bit down. Now, what is the steps to uh, create or access this class, right? Obviously, you have to define the object. So this is an arbitrary variable. And for instantiating the class, you have to use double parenthesis. Since this Dunder method required a default parameter value for to assign this value, right? So I'm assuming, I'm providing the value to this Dunder method. So let's say Rob, first name, and William, right? Okay, what if I execute this? Nothing, right? So since um, it doesn't have any information on the object itself, because there is no method to return the data, right? So what if I choose print object? Um, if you this not a human readable information, right? Otherwise, of course, I said, if you deep dive on what is exactly this output, you might able to correlate with the Python itself. This is the main method of the program, and it's called uh, the employee class. And this employee class is part of the object, yes, and it's stored on a given memory address, right? But there is no way right now I cannot have any meaningful data from the given class itself, right? So one thing is I can access the variable like this, right? But I still have to do the print statement. If I do the print statement, what is happening here? When I um, when I execute this, right? When I execute this print statement, I from where this value is returning, right? So what was happening behind the scene is when you when you type print when you write the print statement on top of the object, this print statement by default it call the um, string function or string method behind the scene, and it rendered the value in the front end or in an output, right? Even if I you can able to correlate this information in the Python terminal also without like this. If I execute also, it should work. I don't see any issues, right? That's what happening. This string statement, it returning whether I can able to print the value, right? Let's print first name, right? So this is what happening um, when we call this print of the object of the instance variable, and this print function which is calling this string method and returning the data back to our program. So ideally this is what happening in the backend of when you call this print statement. So but at the moment I cannot access anything, right? Even with my print statement I should able to, I don't see any value itself. So that is where the dunder str will help us to provide some meaningful name itself. So what does it mean is if I type dunder str and self, let's say um, employee first name, um, employee first name and last name, Um, let's assume like this, um, first name and last name, and F. Then I have to choose self, right? Self. Uh, what if I execute still nothing, but if you run this program in a Python IDE, you should see uh, this value itself. What does the mean is if I get rid of this str statement, what we saw earlier, it returned some non non-readable, it's not meaningful day output, right? But if I enable this dunder str and if I run back, what are we seeing? Employee, Rob, and William, right? So this is how you can uh, access the string object itself from the given object. The object is obviously it's calling the class. The class, if doesn't have any dunder str method, then by default it will return some not I mean return some unmeaningful output. But if you have done the str method, you should have you should get the some meaningful data for a given class itself, right? So this is the actual reason you might notice many of the core programming concept they might use this under str as part of their functionality to access what itself the class is returning as a string, right? Because um, without having the meaningful data as a string or some number, right? We cannot uh, have meaningful information for a given object, right? So this is also nothing but you can also access like print or format of object. Still, right? Because it return as a string. So as a string, you can use this f string format in order to access the value or access the or read that string itself, right? So that is the main reason uh, we are explicitly providing the string method for a given class. So if I get rid of this dunder str method, yes, still your class able to access, you can able to create an object, but there is no option to get to know about the object itself, right? Because at the moment I enable that, so there is no understandable output value if you don't have a dunder str method. Okay, so then what is the situation this dunder representation will require? Okay, let me add def representation dunder str method self. So this method is usually will helpful for debugging your code. This is not something like returning the value to the any of the output program. We'll see in a moment what does it mean. Let's say the same self. Let me copy this for a moment. And if I run this, what we're seeing, still the same value, right? What if I enable back this dunder str? Now we do have both dunder str and dunder representation method, right? What if I execute this? Is is coming from where, right? That is the question. So let me add another method call. I mean, let me add a string like here and here, and we can have a differentiation. Okay, what is the which from which method the output is returning back, right? If I execute this, what we're seeing, so it's returning from dunder str method. That is the case. So by default, if your class has the dunder str method, then it will return the dunder str method. In case if your dunder str method is not exist, then your representation method will call. So what if I uh, want to call or access this representation method, right? You can simply use representation method and you can run that. And if I run representation method, I should be able to access my dunder representation values, right? So, okay, then what is, when you say dunder method is useful for debugging purpose. So what does it mean debugging purpose, right? Let's assume I'm gonna add um, one more parameter here, self dot class name dot, sorry, underscore dot name. If I call this, I should see what is my class, right? So let me get rid of all this stuff. Um, let's say employee class. If I remove my representation method, then by default it will get the str. Yes, that's right. And this dunder representation will help us to know um, what is the class itself, right? If I remove, if I remove and just have the object instance, let's say hello, and you you may not able to see this differentiation. The reason is this is not a Python terminal, right? Um, so it has to return some value, some kind of value, right? So since this object itself doesn't have any returning statement, and that's why it was showing this value. So let me try to simulate the Python terminal. So if I execute string, so by default, remember by default, if you provide without string method, then it will return this print statement will call this dunder state method and it will return that value, right? But in order to access this value, my dot underscore dunder representation method, so you should simply access like this. So this way, for example, in your other objects, you can simply access. Let me try to do that. While true, and let me object equal to object print t. Okay, I don't want to do that. Um, what I was trying to do is I want to it doesn't have any uh, information, right? Because um, let me do one thing. Maybe what I can do is um, ran module Python shell. Let me open my Python shell. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to type the same thing. Let me copy that, right? So why do you want to waste your time? Let me copy this, enter. Okay, now we created a class. So this is the best uh, way to determine, to take a look how the gender str and gender representation having difference. So let's create the object employee, right? Employee. And what is the first name? First name is Rob and William. Okay, I created. If I type print obj, what should I expect? I should expect a gender str value. Yes, right? And what if I type obj? Wow, this is the where. This is the reason I want to show you in Python terminal what is the difference between obj without print statement and with print statement. If you access the object without printing, by default it will call the gender representation method, so that we should be able to um, see, hey, what is this object itself, right? So that is the reason this gender representation will help us to debugging our program itself. That is the reason many programs you might see something like about the class name or attribute names or method names they have used in the gender representation method rather than having this kind of string, right? So if I use this instance object in another program, then I should be able to see, hey, this object is belongs to this class, right? So this is not a string, right? If I type str obj, then it is a string. And if I type representation of obj, and this is a class, right? So this is the actual difference between gender str versus gender representation. Gender str is helpful for having the meaningful name for your given class, and it is more human readable format for a given object, right? If your object is have this gender method, then it should return some human readable output. And gender representation method also, it's a meaningful method, but it will not help anything from the string perspective, but it will helpful for an object for an debugging perspective. So that is um, all about the having the uh, differentiation between the gender str and gender representation. Okay, now let's take a real-time, real-world example where this, which is helpful to have this gender str and gender representation concept. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to take a look on Django, right? So I already created the Django project as part of the Django series. Now I'm going to use the same models in order to explain the stuff here. Um, I created a Django model and I created the Django project and block app here. And if you're not familiar with Django, then just stick on with this. Think about it as a class, not anything related to uh, web development. This is just think about all about the uh, how we can create the class and how we can access the Dender str and Dender representation in the real time world. As part of this real time situation, I'm using Django. If you're not familiar with Django, uh, kindly take a look on the Django Models series, which I also is a part of our tutorial as well. Okay, as you see here in my Django model.py, I do have model name called topping, and this topping class is inherited from this model, and I do have some field name. Now, if I want to add Dender str and say self, I want to mention some like um, this is your topping, or I don't want to have a any name. Rather, I just want to return my field name. Okay. After whatever you do the changes on your model, whatever you do, we have to do the migration, right? It's always better practice, though it's not getting reflected. Yes. And since um, okay, okay, let me get rid of this for a moment. I'm just remove this, and if I go to my Django admin page, go to toppings, what we are seeing like an object. That's what we see, right? If I um, if I don't have, let's assume if I don't have this dunder str method, then if I call my object like this, then if I type object, then it is return the object, right? That's what is happening. It returned the object. Rather, I want to have my uh, string value. That is the reason this dunder str method, if I enable back and if I refresh my admin page, what we are seeing, we are getting the object value itself, right? That is the real world example of having the dunder str method on Django. I hope it little bit will get, I mean, got a little bit clarity on the dunder str method. Okay, then what is the use case of having dunder rep in real time? Let's say dunder representation, self, and as I mentioned, this for debugging purpose, let me add a string. I want to know from which class this has been called. So I'm adding the class dot underscore name underscore underscore and toppings for this self dot top name. So this way I came to I will get my what is the class has been triggered and what is my topping name, right? So this as I mentioned earlier, this is only for debugging. If I let me do the migration. What is the error? It's throwing an error. Oh, here I have to close. If I close this, it should go away. Yes, I have to do the make migration and migrate and run server. If I refresh my page, I don't see any changes. Then what is the purpose? Right? As I mentioned, this is for debugging purpose. Okay, now I want to know, um, I want to mimic my front-end development um, using Django shell, right? Let me exit and clear my screen, and I'm going to use Django out of the box shell concept. Now I want to read my models. This is a topping model, right? Topping. And since it's an object, I want to read, get the first topping, which is basically mushroom. That's why I'm giving one id equal to 1 is a mushroom. If I type object, what will I expect? If it's object, then it will call it will call dunder representation method, right? What if I type print object, it should return dunder str method, right? So let me type yes, it executed the string value as a mushroom. If I type obj, what you're seeing, toppings is my class name, right? Toppings is class name, and I also having another word called toppings here. And what is my topping name? It's a mushroom. Cool, right? This is way I can understand, okay, this object is belongs to employee, sorry, topping class. Okay, then I can use this for different purpose. So that you can think of various option. Having this dunder representation method will help us to debug our code uh, in a real-time situation like this, guys. Okay, so in a in a short and simple, dot str dunder str method, it's a human readable output value, dunder representation method, which will helpful for debugging purpose. So that is all about dunder str versus dunder representation. So if you like this video, just like this, just give a thumbs up button and subscribe my video. This also provided comments that will help me to um, come up with more videos like this. Um, we'll see you in another video, guys. Bye.